Howdy bubs and welcome back. Today we'll be continuing our adventures in Game Maker, and this time we're going to focus on adding weapons to the enemy. Before we get into that though, there is one fix from the previous video that I need to address. I previously did not have the correct code for interacting with a melee attack on the enemy. If you attempt to do this, it'll crash instead of dealing damage. It was because I forgot to include the portion that told it that whenever I hit the enemy to record where it was hit from. So let's go into here and take a look at melee. Over in melee, I added the following line here. The hit from attribute is going to be created for whatever we're hitting, and it's going to be based off of whether the image X scale is facing to the left or right. If the X scale is positive, then that means it's hit from 0. If the image X scale is negative, false, it is not greater than 0, then we'll attribute it to 180. This will let our hit from know where the hit is coming from, so that way it correspondingly moves in that direction. The 0 and 180 are degrees. 0 would be on the right side, 180 would be over onto the left side. Once you have added that fix, the melee attacks will correctly register on the enemy and deal damage without having to worry about them crashing because it doesn't know where the hit came from for it to fly. Let's go back over into our enemy, and here this is where we're going to want to focus on creating the components necessary for having our enemy with a weapon. So let's go into our variables. We're going to have an additional variable added here, and this one is going to be armed. This is going to be a boolean. By default, I have it as false. You can set it to true if you want your enemy to have a weapon all the time. In our create event, let me go ahead and maximize the size. In our create event, we're going to have an if statement that says if armed is true, my weapon is equal to instance underscore create layer in RX, RY position in the correct layer for our code. So let me double check what my room has. I'll throw this in the weapons layer. So returning back to our event. In the weapons layer, I'm going to create O enemy weapon. O enemy weapon, of course, currently does not exist. That is what we're going to create momentarily. So with my weapon, I'm going to give it some basic attributes. And owner is equal to other.id, so that way we can have our enemy recognize that it has its weapon, my weapon, and then the weapon recognize who its owner is so that they can reference each other as needed. Then level is equal to other.level. This will let us scale up and reference the corresponding things needed for how much damage we deal. Then finally, else my weapon is equal to none. With that, we can now have our weapon created anytime our enemy is created. All of the interactions with the weapon itself has to be handled with its own object, which we're going to create momentarily. We will also end up creating a projectile object for the enemy weapon as well, for the enemy projectile it will be creating. I have already created 2 sprites. If we come over to the workspace and scroll down, we can see that I've created S-Ray, which will serve as my enemy projectile, and S-Raygun, which serves as my enemy weapon. Let's go back into the events and take a look at a few other things. We have the weapon created in our create event. There's a couple of other things to update in our other code. So in our begin step, whenever our enemy dies, we need to make sure the weapon gets removed with them. So with my weapon, and this is important why we're able to relate the two together, with my weapon, I want to make sure that I have instance underscore destroy, so that way the gun is removed whenever the enemy dies. And then just for fun, I'm going to make dust, and in this case, the amount 5 dust, true and true, it'll go in both directions, it'll just make a poof whenever it gets deleted. Now in our step event, we're not going to really add anything, it's more of just reorganize things. We have this chunk of code right here, which allowed us to determine if our enemy could see the player. I want to turn this into a script because our weapon is going to have to use this, so that way we don't have the weapon firing projectiles whenever it has no chance of actually hitting the player. So here, I'm going to make sure I cut this, and I'll replace it with a script that is can see player. So of course it doesn't exist at the moment because we're going to go over into our scripts. This will be something related to combat. I'm going to create a new script, can see player, and this will simply return the results of this conditional check. Point distance, and so in this case we can specify the distance, and so here this will be distance. So if the point distance that we're looking at between the player and ourselves, whatever ourselves happen to be, is less than this distance, then this portion returns true. The other check is to make sure it does not collide with a wall. So long as both of these are true, it'll return true. So we can move into our step event once more. In can see player, we just need to pass in one argument, 600 for the distance between the player and the enemy that would begin checking for. And in here we can just confirm that everything's still working fine. Yep, and we see the enemy is reacting just as before. With that last change, our enemy code is actually complete. Our new object is going to be dealing with our enemy gun and our enemy projectile. So let's go into weapons, and I will create a new object. And this will be enemy weapon. I will go ahead and select a new sprite, and if I go into my range section, I can see S ray gun. Have that there. While I'm at it, let me go ahead and create a new object for enemy projectile. And in here I'm going to reference the ray. Now with these two things, my objects are created, and now we're ready to begin working in the code. Let's go ahead and have a create event and a step event, specifically begin step. Then over in enemy projectile, we'll have two events, a post draw event, as well as a animation end event. With these two things, let's go ahead and maximize them. So we've just got the code. Then with our enemy weapon in our create event, let's go ahead and initialize. And in here I'm going to have two variables, countdown rate, which I'm going to set to 40. This will be a rate of fire in frames. And then next we'll have our current countdown, which is equal to countdown rate. And so initially we have a delay of at least 40 frames. Then over in our begin step, this is where we're going to have all of the code for moving the ray gun or the enemy weapon, whatever you've got. So our x value is simply going to be equal to our owner.x value. I'm going to keep it matched up. And our y value is going to be equal to owner.y plus 10 pixels is I think what it works out for my enemy to have the ray gun in a reasonable location. Then I'll make sure to have image x scale is equal to the absolute value of the owner.image x scale. Then our image y scale is also equal to the absolute value of our owner.image y scale. This will ensure that the weapon is correctly facing the appropriate side and it is scaled up as large or as small as our enemy. So the smaller enemies will actually have smaller weapons and the bigger enemies will have bigger weapons. Then if instance exists of our O player, that tells us the player does exist, so we need to try to aim at them. What we'll do in here is if O player dot x is less than our x value, then I'll just make sure that regardless of what direction the enemy is facing, our weapon will actually be facing the right direction. What this will do is ensure that our weapon is flipped accordingly, so that way whenever the enemy is aiming behind itself, that way it'll be faced right side up. Then if can see player, this will be using the script that we just wrote, and I'll use 600 pixels as well. If we can see the player within 600 pixels and there's no wall blocking us, we're going to make sure that our weapon is aiming at them, and so image angle is going to be equal to point direction of x comma y at O player dot x and O player dot y. I'm going to reduce countdown by 1 frame. Then if countdown is less than or equal to 0, then we're eligible to fire at the player. And so I'm going to set my countdown to be now equal to countdown rate, setting it back to restart. And then with instance underscore create layer at the X and Y positions. And then let's see, what layers do we have in here? We will do this in the projectiles layer, projectiles. And we're going to create an O enemy projectile. And close this off with this. We can then specify the speed for our projectile will be equal to 5. Our damage is going to be equal to other.level times 2. So whatever our enemy's level is, we'll multiply that by 2, and that'll be how much damage the projectiles will send out. Then direction is going to be equal to other.image angle plus random range, and the projectile will have a range of -3 to 3 added to whatever the direction is, and then image angle will just match our direction. This, let's see, does complete everything for our enemy weapon. Now we just need to go into our enemy projectile and give it its code. In our post draw event, this portion is just drawing bullet before wall. And so if place meeting x comma y comma o wall, make dust whenever this impacts any wall. And so that actually will include our obstacles as well. And I'll make 15 dust, and this will be true and true. The dust cloud will go in all directions. And then instance underscore destroy. So whenever we hit the wall, in our case, not the bullet, in my case, my ray gun, my ray blast will impact, make a cloud of dust, and be destroyed. Then for animation end, this will lock to second frame. What I'm going to do here is, looking back at my sprite, I have 2 frames. The frame whenever it is shot, and then the frame whenever it is moving. I want to make sure my code correctly locks it at the moving frame. So image underscore speed is equal to 0. Image underscore index is equal to 1. This will lock it at the second frame. So whenever it's shot initially, you see this, then it'll fire along and you'll see this as it is moving. Then finally, before we jump in and give some of our enemies weapons, we do need to make sure our player has some reactions whenever it gets shot. Then over here in our player, I'm going to go ahead and add a collision event. If under our weapons we are colliding with a projectile, then we need to address hit by projectile. And here, we just need to add in the code for when something interacts with us with other instance underscore destroy. Whatever hits us needs to be removed. And in addition to that, we need to receive damage. So damage target by other dot damage, and add in a little bit of screen shake. In this case, a magnitude of 10 and for 10 frames. That should be good. We can again play around with those numbers as we see fit. Now, going into our room, let's go ahead and give, let's see, in the enemies layer, I'm going to remove this targetable. We no longer need that. And I'm going to give this enemy is currently in sentry mode. I'm going to modify its arm state so that way it will have a weapon. Now let's see what happens here. And we see it fires at the player. Somewhat fast. Maybe I want to modify that. And you see a little cloud of dust appears whenever it ends up hitting the obstacle there. And we see it does actually deal damage to us. That'll be something we'll have to play around with. In the next one, whenever we have player death, as you can see, I actually have a negative health, since the picking up new health isn't helping me. But our enemy is now successfully shooting at us. One issue we need to address is I need to move my enemies layer to be below weapons, so that way I can see the weapons whenever they are in the game. So let's try this again. And there we go, we see a tiny little weapon right there. Move this, and we see the ray gun is aiming at us. We're receiving damage. And then I can just as easily get rid of my enemy, and the ray gun has been removed from the game. If I restart, you can see that they've got the ray gun, but there's no interactions currently going on because they cannot see me at this moment. Right now I'm hidden, it's not shooting at me, but should I jump over, it now begins aiming. You see it only follows if it can see me. As soon as I jump, it begins following once again, and there we go. We now have enemy weapons, we have their projectiles, we have the code interaction for them to hit the player, and with all of the infrastructure already set up, the player is now receiving damage. We're not going to have player death quite yet, as there's a little bit more that goes into it. But for the time being, that's all I have for y'all today. If you have any questions or need any assistance, just let me know in class. Otherwise, everyone have a good one. I just wanted to say thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. Shout out to my bad bubs, my top 5, my day ones. Y'all have always been there for me. Next up, my baby bubs, the next 5. I always love y'all's support. And finally, for everyone else, any little bit helps. Thank you to all my basic bubs for supporting me along my journey. If you want to continue receiving notifications, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell button.